David, you are one of the key commentators on this issue, the Scottish referendum and Scottish politics. You have obviously received high praise for your books and your journalist and academic work on these matters. Your opinion, as I know it, is always relevant, original, insightful. So it's with great pleasure and excitement that we take the opportunity to have this conversation with you. Thank you for taking some time and being here with us. The whole process of the Scottish referendum had everything to be one of the most exciting things in modern politics. It was about, first of all, sovereignty, that some people would say is the mother of all political issues. It was about a dramatic constitutional question. It was about the breakup of, some say, the most perfect political and economic union between nations. It was about a country and a people deeply divided on the issue and on the model of its own liberty. It was about a risky gamble by the British political establishment that could have gone badly wrong, terribly wrong, to that political elite, mainly the government in Westminster. It was also about a decision that could have set a standard and an example that could have shaken the foundations of the European Union and could still shake those foundations of the European Union, as we know, the most intriguing and fragile of modern constitutional experiments. And it was, in the end, it was also about, and let me quote Boris Johnson, it was also about that great oxymoron, an exciting speech by Gordon Brown. So, however, as I see it outside the UK, the most remarkable or noteworthy thing about this whole process was how unremarkable it was for us, at least until the last couple of weeks, when that infamous poll came out and gave us the prospect of yes winning. And so I would like to begin to ask you to give us some historical background on this issue and why apparently all of a sudden everything changed and Scotland could have indeed voted yes to its independence.
How far back do you want me to go? You say historical background. I suppose it's interesting to go back to 1955. There was a general election that year. Winston Churchill had just resigned as Prime Minister. He was very old, not really capable of being Prime Minister anymore. Anthony Eden had taken over, a younger, very charismatic politician. And in that general election in Scotland, the Unionist Party, the Conservative Party, wins a majority of votes and also a majority of MPs. So you have at that point the sort of high watermark of unionism in Scotland as part of the United Kingdom. The vast majority of Scots are content being part of Great Britain. By the 1960s, the SNP, the Scottish National Party, who want independence, begin to gain ground. There are many explanations for this. The British Empire is being shed slowly, which of course has an impact on how Britain sees itself. The economy, after the boom of the 50s, is beginning to fragment. There is a tilt away from the Commonwealth towards Europe, which has all sorts of issues of its own. And so the SNP, the independence movement, begins to gather steam, and by the 70s, in October 1974, they win 30% of the vote and 11 MPs. That instigates the debate about devolution to the Scottish Parliament. By the 1980s, you have Margaret Thatcher, who was a memorable catalyst for all sorts of major shifts in politics. She didn't increase support for independence, but she did increase the support for a Scottish Parliament. She increased support, crucially, for the idea of Scots and Scotland as distinctive from the rest of the United Kingdom, and although many nationalists would be reluctant to admit it, the idea that Scots were politically and morally superior to the English in particular, By the 90s, you have the creation of a devolved Scottish Parliament. So for the first time, you have a political outlet for those expressions. Initially, the SNP don't do well, but by the first decade of this century, they at first become a minority government in the Scottish Parliament, and then in 2011, a majority government. So there, I suppose, in the past 6-7 decades, you have the outline of an incremental move towards, I suppose, I don't like the word inevitable. I think few things in politics are truly inevitable. But you have the obvious endpoint, or a likely endpoint, of a referendum on independence, which, because of the British Constitution and that we don't have one, was always quite straightforward to happen, unlike in Spain, where it's much more complicated. So you have that sort of culmination. So tracing it from 1955, the high watermark, to 2014, when you have 45% of Scots voting for independence. It's quite a remarkable shift, and in the grand scheme of things, in not a very long space of time. It's actually a very short period.
I would like to have your views on what are the main reasons or main arguments for and against independence. We know there are existential and utilitarian arguments. We know there are emotional and intellectual. We know there are economic and spiritual, and there are some that are more deeply rooted, and others that are more circumstantial. And I once I saw someone ask you, or probably it was your opinion, that probably independence or nationalism is not an ideology, is a solution asking for a problem, or in search of a problem. You spoke about Margaret Thatcher. The rise in nationalist views in Scotland was probably a reaction against the circumstance of the moment, and not an ideology per se. What do you think about this?
The question of whether nationalism is
because we can translate that to Catalonia or to
sure.
Belgium.
And it's tricky because, of course, nationalisms tend to be opportunistic. They latch on to whatever argument is convenient. So in the 1970s, the SNP talked about oil. North Sea oil had been discovered. Obviously, this had a huge economic impact in the UK, which was doing very badly at that stage. In the 1980s, the argument for independence was to escape from Margaret Thatcher. In the 1990s, the argument became that Scotland and the UK were so economically prosperous that Scotland could afford to be independent. In the last decade, it was because of the Iraq War. And now, in the past few years, you have a sort of jumble of all those different reasons. But of course, the SNP pre-exists Margaret Thatcher, North Sea oil, the Iraq War. So there was an impetus and an argument from the 1930s onwards. And then it was much more about identity, which of course still plays a part, but much less of a part. That Scots are distinct, they have a distinctive culture, a distinct political culture, and the argument is that Scotland in general is more left-wing than the rest of the United Kingdom, England in particular, which is seen as more right-wing. Both those things are simplifications. It's much more complicated than that. You ask also about the arguments against independence. In truth, the question of independence and the SNP were considered irrelevant for so long, and were not considered a threat, that those who supported the United Kingdom didn't really make an argument. It was simply accepted that the Union, the United Kingdom, was a good thing which benefited everyone, and therefore the argument wasn't made. And by the point of the referendum, you find Unionists struggling actually to make a cogent vote-winning argument. Sure, in an economic sense, they could point to obvious arguments about higher public spending in Scotland and how that would be lost, and how independence would create economic instability, as there had been in Quebec in 1995 and in Canada. But in terms of making an emotional argument for the Union, they struggled. Gordon Brown did a better job than most, but he came very late on in a very long campaign.
I would like to, talk about that a little bit more, because for the outsider, it's very difficult to understand what arguments could be made for the breakup of the United Kingdom, for Scotland, because we are used to make arguments in favor of a self-determination of repressed countries, and Scotland is not a repressed country. Alex Salmond said at some point that we have no need to be liberated.
Yeah.
The UK is a 300 years old free union of nations. Scotland is not a part of England. Is internationally recognized as a nation in itself. So I always thought that this would be a question, a matter of identity. But actually, when I watched the debates and all the discussions, it was all about making circumstantial argument on the economic case for independence, and it fell short of probably of what it should have been.
Yeah. No, I think that's a reasonable point. To the outside, I often wondered what outsiders made of it, and indeed during the final stages, practically every major European political correspondent was in Edinburgh and London at some stage. So it was always interesting to gauge how they saw it. And a lot of them were expecting some big argument on principles, on nationhood, on identity, and instead they found us arguing about welfare policy and the specifics of income tax and corporation tax. And that is because the SNP had very deliberately shifted the terms of debates over the past few decades away from flags, away from old-fashioned imagery and historical arguments. They moved it on to what they call utilitarian discussions of social and economic policy. But bundled up in that was a sense of national identity, because it was assumed, as I suggested earlier, that Scots have a different attitude towards welfare, a more generous attitude towards welfare, that they're keener on redistribution in terms of taxation, that they're more left-wing, they're more egalitarian, more committed to equality. All of those things in Scotland are accepted to the point that no one questions them. In polling terms, in terms of surveys, there's actually fairly limited evidence, and on most aspects of public policy, your average Scot thinks pretty much like your average English person. But the narrative in Scotland is that we are different and superior and approach these things in a different way. So the Scottish Government, the SNP, took that assumption, however simplistic, and said, as a result, if Scotland is independent, we will do things better than Conservatives, and a lot of this was directed towards hostility to the Conservative Party. We will do things in a different way from England, from the UK, we will do things better. Scotland will become richer, fairer, a better place to live. And they were very successful in developing that argument.
Yes, one of the things that strikes me as very strange on that narrative is how close the progressives, and even the Portuguese progressives, for instance, were close to the yes persuasion, because Scotland has in the UK everything that the progressives hope to have in the European Union. You have currency union, with fiscal union, with VAT union, with social union. You have the same national health service. You have the same pension system, etc., etc. And why would Scotland like to substitute this status quo to be part of this notorious mess in that aspect that is the European Union?
There was always an intellectual contradiction there until, just to give you some context, until the late 1980s, the Scottish National Party actually wanted to withdraw from the European Union. And there was a certain consistency there. if sovereignty was the ultimate prize, if decision-making was best taken in Scotland, then it made sense to not only leave the UK, but the EU. But of course, the political mood shifted. Even in the UK in the 80s, most parties were pro-European, and the SNP shifted with them. But at the same time, they never really explained why they couldn't share a union with Wales, England, and Northern Ireland, because they were so different from Scotland economically and socially, and yet they could share another union with Portugal, with Spain, with Greece, with Germany, all countries which are arguably much more different from Scotland than England. Even if Scotland became independent, the country it would have most in common with would be England, by virtue of a common language, a shared history to a degree, a shared culture, a border, So that argument never really made much sense. And as I pointed out at the time, a lot of the SNP's criticisms of the UK, it was unequal, economically damaged, and undemocratic, applied equally to the European Union. It's very difficult to make an argument that the European Commission and Council of Ministers are somehow
You don't want Westminster, but you want Brussels.
Yeah. And somehow Brussels is more democratic
the rationale
than the House of Commons. It doesn't make any sense. And also, if inequality between the component parts of the Union is your concern, then here is the European Union with considerable inequality. Yeah. And the European Union, like the UK, is dominated, of course, by France and Germany.
Okay, so I would like to concentrate now a bit more on the economic case for independence. Was it or was it not completely hyped?
Well, it was very easy to make an economic argument for independence because, of course...
Once you quoted Michael Ignatieff, the Liberal leader, saying that what Scotland wanted was independence without its economic and psychological cost.
Yeah.
Because they wanted to keep the pound, they wanted to keep the monarchy, they wanted to keep the currency union, everything.
Yeah. Ignatieff also joked that what Quebecers wanted was an independent Quebec within a united Canada. Yeah. And you could argue that what a lot of Scots want is an independent Scotland within the United Kingdom. There is a contradiction there. But the economic argument was to some extent easy to make because it was dealing with a hypothetical scenario, that is, an independent Scotland, and so you could project onto that whatever you wanted. But Alex Salmond, who was an economist by background a very long time ago, 40 years ago, his economic knowledge was rather out of date, but it was his belief that a smaller country like Scotland could operate in an increasingly globalized economy in a much more flexible, much more creative way. Although, fascinatingly, his economic views in that respect are pretty orthodox and centre-right. He believes that by cutting taxes you increase growth, and he believes with increased growth you can skim off the economic proceeds to spend on more generous welfare. This is otherwise known as the third way. This was Tony Blair's ideology. If you improve the economy, you can spend more money on social programs. Of course, that model has, as we now know, it has its limitations. Alex Salmond was chiefly influenced by Ireland from the late 1980s. He'd studied very closely. They cut corporation tax, they cut other taxes, and had a boom, a sustained boom, which of course didn't last. And he firmly believed that model could be taken from Ireland and applied to Scotland.
It all depended on currency union.
Yeah, and again...
How could he make that case when currency union was rejected by all parts minus the SNP?
Well, indeed. I think the reality of it was that if Scotland had become independent, some sort of currency union would have been negotiated. I think, on sharing, two countries sharing that island.
It's a bit of a bailout, probably.
Yeah.
Without that name.
Well, indeed. What would have come with it were terms and conditions which made it rather difficult. The Bank of England would have stipulated on spending, on borrowing, on interest rates, all of that. And it then throws into question what sort of independence is this?
Right. When you don't control your currency.
Indeed. Now, the SNP retorted. They said, well, are you telling us that Germany and that Portugal are not independent countries because they share a currency? Which was a reasonably good counter-argument. But of course, arguably, you are
You should
less...
be invited to come here.
but arguably, you are less independent. Now, Ireland was a good example. Ireland, is a sovereign country, also a member of the European Union, but for several years, Brussels was quite literally deciding on their public spending limits. Is that independence? In an academic sense, it's independence, but in practical terms, in reality, it's not independence. It's certainly not monetary independence, nor is it really fiscal independence when it comes to it. So the SNP's policy of keeping the British pound even with independence never really made much sense. Bearing in mind their own arguments about decisions being best taken in Scotland.
They said, as I remember, that they would keep the pound even if England didn't want them to keep the pound.
Yeah, I mean that was an even more unconvincing argument. Now, of course, it's a fully tradable currency.
In that case, they had to build they would have to build a monetary base then.
Yeah, currency reserves.
Reserves and what's the debt on?
It's very, very large. Yeah, and Scotland
90% of the GDP.
Yeah, and Scotland's share of that is not much better in proportionate terms. Yeah, to use another country's currency, as Panama does with the dollar, you need significant currency reserves. And the SNP never really answered the question in terms of where those would come from.
Where would they attract capitals in this economic climate?
If you did, it would be at borrowing rates much higher than the rest of the UK. And so that was probably the weakest part of the pro-independence case. But interestingly, how the United Kingdom handled it was not the best. George Osborne, the Chancellor, said we will not allow Scotland to use the currency. The argument became one of Scotland against Westminster, and because people hold Westminster in low regard, they didn't like the messenger. George Osborne is a particularly unpopular politician. And so it backfired. Even though their argument was a good one, their argument against the currency union was a good one, the way they presented it served to undermine the strength of their case.
Let me just turn for a moment to hard politics. Do you think the SNP won the elections in 2011, and they promised a referendum on independence? Do you think that Cameron was right to give you the referendum on the base of an assumption that people voted on the SNP, people that voted on the SNP voted for independence on the general election?
Well, I'm not sure that was his assumption. I think his assumption was actually that a lot of people who'd voted for the SNP in 2011 didn't want independence, paradoxically. That they just wanted the SNP to run the devolved parliament because they thought they were quite good at it. Was Cameron correct? It's fun to play what-if games. And Madrid, the way Spain has responded to Catalonia, perhaps offers the alternative scenario of central government saying, no, this is illegal, you cannot hold a referendum and we will stop you holding it. That, to me, would have backfired enormously. Now, of course, you can argue at the same time, but he did agree to a referendum and support for independence increased. And so he's stuck between a rock and a hard place. It's very difficult to figure out what he could have done which could have got a different outcome.
But was it do you think he was forced to it by the circumstances, or do you think he really wanted it, Cameron, because he thought that because of all the Olympic Games and the British nationalism, not Scottish or English, British nationalism that came with the Olympic Games, because it's not England against Scotland, it's Team Britain, Team GB on the Olympics. Do you think he was opportunity. He seized the opportunity
Yes.
to solve the question for a generation.
Yes,
Or
he genuinely thought by holding the referendum and the polls showed support for independence at around 33%. He genuinely thought it would produce a 2-to-1 majority against independence, and that would put it to rest for a generation. Interestingly, his thinking behind the European Union referendum is very similar. He thought that this was an opportunity to put it to rest, and it's gone wrong on that front too. His mistake, I think, in retrospect, was in timing. The Edinburgh Agreement, was reached in October 2012, and it gave the Scottish Government 2 years to hold a referendum, which of course gave them 2 years to develop the arguments, change the mood, introduce certain policies, and that was much too long. David Cameron should have insisted on a referendum by the end of 2013 or by the summer of 2013, which was a much shorter time frame. He was much too relaxed on the timing. And of course, the Scottish Government deliberately held the referendum towards the end of this year because they knew the general election was coming up next year, the UK general election, and they knew that probably the Conservatives would be ahead in the polls. Scots don't really like the Conservative Party, and therefore they would be confronted with a choice of voting no and having more austerity and more Conservatives, or voting yes to a land of milk and honey and no more Tories like David Cameron. And so they framed it in a very simplistic way, of course, but in a very smart, tactical way to maximise their
Let's
chances.
look to the future now. Is this over?
No, far from it. I've described how the SNP were very good at shaping that political narrative, that argument. They still have control of that argument, and they've not let go of controlling that since referendum day. All the parties who won the referendum, the Labour Party, the Conservatives, the Liberal Democrats, are all in trouble to some extent. They've lost leaders, they're losing support. The SNP, the party which lost the referendum, now has 50,000 new members. It's storming ahead in opinion polls. It's about to have a new leader who has incredibly high approval ratings, unlike any other politician in the UK. But more to the point, there are now several more opportunities for the question to be put again. There is a UK general election next year, when polling shows the SNP could do significant damage to Labour in Scotland, in seats Labour have held for decades. In the Scottish Parliament elections in 2016, where the SNP will be defending a majority and very likely getting another one. And then by the end of 2017, you have a possible referendum on the UK and the EU. In that context, the question of Scottish independence will inevitably come up again. So far from drawing a line under the question, it's actually given rise to many more questions for at least the next 3.
So the situation is a bit different than Quebec, because they had a referendum in 95?
1980 and then 1995. So
yes,
there was a significant gap.
In 95 there was 51% against 49,
yeah,
wasn't it? And
even closer, I think. Yeah.
Yes, and as I think now, since then the pro-independence camp has slowed down on its momentum.
Significantly. And the party.
Do you think the same can happen in Scotland, or is not very likely?
I think it's too late. As I say, the dynamic is such that the losing parties, the nationalist side, have retained control of the argument and the narrative in a way that was not the case in Canada. It could have happened had the unionist parties moved in a different way, but it's not.
Anyway, the referendum posed the federalist question in England. What are your views on that?
Well, I'm a born-again federalist, and I have all the zeal of a convert. And I think that the United Kingdom has always been a rather odd country. It's, there's England, then England and Wales, England and Scotland, Great Britain and Ireland, then most of Ireland leaves. The United Kingdom has 3 different legal systems, 4 different education systems, 2 national religions. The Queen changes religion when she crosses the border, which is very unusual. It has 4 devolved.
How very convenient.
Yes. It has 4 devolved assemblies or parliaments. It has 3 self-governing crown dependencies, Guernsey, Jersey, and Isle of Man. It is a very odd country, and I just think it would be much more coherent in political and administrative terms if it became a properly federal country. The elephant in the room, as we say in the UK, is England. It's a huge issue. It's by far the largest part of the country, and it needs to be governed differently.
Is it England or London?
Well, interestingly, as someone during the Edinburgh Book Festival put it last year, if there is one part of the UK which is so different from the rest that it ought to be independent, it's not Scotland, it is London. You know, London bears no relation to the rest of England, let alone the rest of the UK. More than 50% of the population of London is now from outside the UK. It's a genuinely
the anti-English resentment is not. It's probably anti-London.
Yeah. If you go to the north of England, they think too much power and wealth is concentrated in London, just the same attitude as in Wales, Scotland, and to an extent Northern Ireland. So yes, London is really what skews the rest of the UK. But I see, and this is playing fantasy constitutions or fantasy politics, but it's good fun. I see London as a sort of independent or semi-autonomous city-state within a British federation. You know, Brussels or Washington DC are self-governing within federal countries, even Canberra in Australia, I think. So it's possible to sort of isolate and harness that formidable energy, but rebalance it. And crucial in that is the House of Lords, which now boasts 850 members, 90 of whom are hereditary and the rest are appointed, as you know, for life. Much too large. It actually does a pretty good job. I will defend the House of Lords to an extent, but it's the largest legislative body outside of China, I think, which poses obvious difficulties. And the best way of balancing out the nations and regions of the United Kingdom would be reforming the House of Lords as a Senate. I know you only have one chamber here, Spain has 2, and the Spanish Senate has a...
Some say we have the Constitutional Court, which is...
Well, sure.
Nowadays is the second chamber, almost.
But the Spanish Senate
that's
has
another problem.
Yes, but the Spanish Senate has a regional component, as of course does the German Bundesrat and so on. It's possible to rebalance large multinational countries that way. And interestingly, just in the past week, Ed Miliband, the leader of the Labour Party, who will almost certainly not be Prime Minister next year, has committed the Labour Party to doing that, something first set out by Gordon Brown, incidentally.
Talking about federalism, what do you think is if there is any consequence of this referendum to the European Union? And what is your opinion of the future of Britain in the European Union? Because that affects us.
A big question. I still think if it's handled properly and the arguments are put in an effective way, that it's possible the UK could vote to stay in the European Union by a majority of, 60% in a few years' time. At the same time, it opens up the same problems of campaigning as the Scottish referendum did. That if you criticise proponents of independence, in this case British independence, you can be accused of scaremongering, accused of trying to scare people, of creating economic falsehoods, and big business can be accused of wielding an undue influence on the political process. All of that will be the same if the UK enters a referendum campaign on the European Union. And the argument for coming out of the European Union is, of course, simplistic. Everything will get better if only we can remove ourselves from Brussels control. All these terrible immigrants will go away, our economy will improve, and so on and so forth. But it has a beguiling simplicity about it. And a lot of people in the UK, in England, and in all parts of the UK, just as in Portugal and across Europe, are unhappy. They're unhappy with austerity, they're unhappy with their personal circumstances, they're unhappy with their future prospects. And naturally, they seek an easy escape from that situation. And so a lot of people increasingly find the United Kingdom Independence Party's proposals, however simplistic and incoherent they often are, increasingly attractive, because it seems to offer them an escape route from things they don't like, and that includes Brussels, it includes immigration, it includes the economic circumstances.
You have just arrived from Madrid, where a recent poll showed that an extreme left party could win the election. It's an extreme left anti-European or anti-EU party. You have UKIP in Britain or England.
Predominantly in England.
Yes, some people say that it's not UKIP, it's
an English nationalist party.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Don't you think that probably the anti-European solution, the exit, Brexit as you call it, the exit of Great Britain, would be a result not of a dramatic change but of a loss of interest, because this if everywhere in Europe parties like these gain momentum.
Sure. Well, the UK has always had a semi-detached relationship with the European Union. I was very struck in the Spanish Congress yesterday to see the Spanish flag side by side with the European Union flag. I've worked at the Houses of Parliament in London and can't recall seeing the European Union flag. We almost behave as if we're not part of the European Union. And we talk about joining Europe when we mean joining the single currency. We conflate the two things. So, is it a loss of interest? The interest has always been limited. The British membership of the European Union came late in 1973, later than of course, the initial members, France and Germany and so on. And it's always been reluctant, it's always been grudging, an anti-European sentiment in the UK, and to an extent in Scotland. As I say, this image of Scotland as somehow being a Europhile country is a caricature. That anti-European, anti-Brussels sentiment whipped up by certain newspapers, chiefly by Boris Johnson. You mentioned when he worked in Brussels as a reporter. He was very talented at creating stories, often untrue, about the excesses of Brussels, and using it to shift public opinion. And so, yes, it's a loss of interest to an extent, but it's also an antipathy to Europe, to the European project, which has always been there, really, to some extent.
Okay, I would like now to turn to the public, if there's any question. You look interested?
I have one question. How do you see that such big issues as independence be given just with a simple majority, when sometimes the winning is made by people who decide last time and don't see all the picture? And for example, in Portugal, for any constitutional modification, we have to have 75% of the parliament to have a big modification in the political life. How can you justify make independence in just simple majorities? And I suspect, I'm not sure, that if you were Scots and you live in UK, in England, it was different. A second question, more. How you see if England makes their own referendum and say, let me give me out of all of these guys who just asked for things and became independent of them?
On majorities, it's now become an accepted feature of British referendums, territorial referendums, that it's a straight majority. And of course, you'll know that the British Constitution works by precedent and convention, and therefore it's very difficult to change that. If you attempted to shift to saying on big important issues it has to be 2/3, you would be accused of gerrymandering and trying to change the results. So I think we're stuck with straight majorities. With the written constitution, you could obviously introduce safeguards and so on. On England, I mean, if a majority of English people wanted to reassert English independence, then they would be in a pretty powerful position to do that. English public opinion is shifting in lots of interesting ways, but it's not quite at that point. They're increasingly unhappy with how the UK is governed in general. They're unhappy that Scottish MPs, despite having devolved power, can still vote on English issues. And so there is a move now led by the government to introduce something called English votes for English laws, summarised to EVIL, unfortunately, EVEL, which will restrict the voting rights of Scottish MPs. So for the first time you will have two classes of MP, basically. And ironically, this is weakening something which binds the UK together, and the weakening is being led by a Conservative government. The ironies never end. But English public opinion is increasingly unhappy with the status quo. It wants more autonomy for England, but it doesn't like the idea of an English parliament. It doesn't like the idea of regional English assemblies, which I suppose would be a key feature of any federal United Kingdom. But they want something. They're just not quite sure what it is yet.
You?
Oh, yes. Ever since 1955, the Conservative Party has plummeted in Scotland. Just used to be 6 seats for Labour until the rise of SNP. You wrote in the past that the Conservatives should rebrand themselves in Scotland. But and politically makes all the sense. But do you think it's possible that a party that is based on unionism to do so? And do you think the promises made on the last week will be concrete, will be able to actually amount to something?
Yeah, I think there were promises made, and I mean, actually they've been made earlier on in the spring. They were remade in the closing weeks of the referendum to devolve more power, extensive new powers, which of course can mean anything you want it to. More autonomy and so on. And that process is ongoing. It's going according to the timetable set out. The Scottish Government, the SNP, is taking part. But the SNP have very successfully developed a betrayal narrative, which began the day after the referendum, that they will not deliver on these promises because they're wicked and they're Conservatives and all the usual stuff. And that has some degree of traction with the electorate, but it bears little relation to the reality. The trouble for unionists is that if your only argument for maintaining the union is to weaken that union even more by devolving more power, it does raise the philosophical point of what exactly is the United Kingdom for. Because it gets to the point where you've devolved so much power that there is, a couple of bits of law between extreme autonomy and full independence. And from the SNP's point of view, they think any more devolution of power is good because it decreases the distance between the status quo and where they want to be, which is independence. So it's a very dangerous and risky game to play, but the unionist parties feel they have no option. What else can they offer Scotland? They can't offer them any more money, so they offer them more power. And that process takes on a life and momentum of its own. And I'm not sure anyone quite realises where that will end up. But yeah, unionism as a political faith, as a political philosophy, I think is in deep trouble.
Anyone? Albert?
One of the main the parties against independence, and in particular the government, said that the independence was not needed because they would give Scotland more competencies, centralised competencies. So what will happen in terms of fiscal or labour or social reforms to give more powers or money to Scotland?
Well, the discussions are ongoing, but it seems likely that income tax will be devolved in full. Some of it's being devolved already. It's a bit of a red herring, income tax, because of course a semi-autonomous government can't cut that because they'll lose revenue, and if they increase taxes they'll lose the next election because voters in Scotland, despite seeing themselves as more left-wing, don't like to pay high taxes. there will be some welfare policy, but welfare is tricky because the UK has a highly integrated and centralised welfare state. Wherever you live in the UK, from Northern Ireland to Wales, England, Scotland, you get the same pension provision, the same healthcare with certain differences, same unemployment benefits. So if you start devolving aspects of that, and some have already been given to Edinburgh, again, I come back to my point that you're weakening actually what unifies the country by chipping away at things which are currently provided across the UK. But that's where this commission is heading. Income tax, some welfare provision, some symbolic things around the edges. But the SNP will say it's not enough. Of course, it's not enough. They want independence, and anything short of independence they will dismiss as being inadequate.
How is the delegation process going? Is it going to actually happen in January?
Yeah, as I say, the timescale is proceeding. It's a very, very short timescale, and there has been criticism of that, but they can't win if they do it too quickly. It's bad if they do it too slowly, then they're taking too long. The impetus is to get it finished by the time of the general election next year. The idea is that the parties will put the proposals in their manifestos, and then they would argue they have some sort of mandate. So yes, the party talks are almost finished. Lord Smith of Kelvin, who's chairing it, has a month to come up with a proposal, which isn't very long. It then has a period of consultation, again not very long, and then by January, Burns Night on the 25th, again it's symbolic. I think he has to deliver the proposals by St Andrew's Day, and then the next stage by Burns Night. So you can see what they were doing there. And yes, now there is a slightly grey area in that they committed to a first reading of a bill by March next year, and that looks like it might slip. The parliamentary calendar is quite tight, but if it does slip, then of course Alex Salmond and everyone else will reap the benefits from that. But I think in all likelihood, it will meet most of what was promised.
But this is
Will it slow down the independence movement?
No. I mean, for all the reasons I've outlined, the momentum is still with the yes, is still with what was the yes campaign. And they're not really interested in more powers. They think the argument has moved on. And as I say, the SNP have created a narrative so that whatever they come up with, it will be deemed inadequate.
This again poses the question of how cynical or how about hard politics this is.
Yeah.
Because as I see it, Cameron wants it done by the next general election.
Yeah.
And as I see it, the evolution process or any constitutional change that makes the Scottish less directly involved in the English democratic process is a benefit for the Tories, because if you take the seats from Scotland, from Westminster, the Tories
it damages Labour.
It damages Labour, and it makes the Tories virtually the party of power in England, isn't it?
Well, the argument.
That's what strikes me as very strange in this calendar, this timetable.
Yeah.
It's very quick, in my opinion.
And also the English votes for English laws process is running in parallel with that. And so yes, and the argument, if the more power Scotland gets, the argument becomes it should have fewer MPs, and that of course means Labour MPs by and large. And as I say, the Conservatives ironically could be doing more to damage a union they claim to want to protect by unintentionally, perhaps subconsciously. They end up hastening the demise of a country they say they want to protect.
Yep.
I'm sorry, but do you think can the SNP actually exist without the issue? Because then they would the government would be, God forbid, judged by the actual governing, and not because of the ambition of sovereignty.
We'll just look at Ireland. The two major parties in Ireland are Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil. There is nothing major between the two parties. You have to go back to the early 1920s and find out what their position was in the Irish Civil War, and you will find an explanation for why there are two parties. So the answer is yes. The SNP, after independence, would simply become a centre-left, mainstream, social democratic party, whatever you want to call it, and they will try and displace Labour for that territory. But although you do make an important point, that the dynamic created by the constant quest for independence does give the party an incredible energy and focus. And interestingly, voters like parties with focus and a vision, even if they don't agree with it. And so once you've removed that, sure, it's probably the case that the SNP would have a loss of energy and a loss of impetus, but it would still exist as a party, as in Ireland. And most parties which achieve independence for their country continue after the event. I can't think of any which sort of wind up and cease operating.
A little bit in continuation of what you're saying, what is your impression regarding the true interest of the Scots, you may say, and the interests of the party leaders or the leader of the party who goes for independence?
Well,
about the personal and why should I be second to Westminster if I can be king in my own country?
well, yeah, sure. Well, Alex Salmond, obviously now about to stop being First Minister, he has an ego like all politicians do. He liked the idea of being a Prime Minister rather than the First Minister. He liked the idea of going straight to Brussels to sit at the top table and so on. So that's part of it. But at the same time, a large number of voters seem to be quite happy with that. So I'm not sure there was much of a gap between his sort of personal ambitions and what he wanted. Because Alex Salmond successfully created the impression that he was the sort of manifestation of Scotland, almost like de Gaulle, I am France, I am Scotland, and therefore anything I do, even if it looks slightly mad or wrong, is in the interests of Scotland and in the interests of advancing Scotland's interests. So he was very good at making man and country the same thing. Now you could argue that was a bit dangerous and autocratic,
yes.
But at the same time he did it very effectively, and he did it democratically.
Civil war in the country.
Well, yeah.
I don't think so for Scotland.
Well, yeah.
Historically, of course, this is a stable union for more than 3 centuries. But we should think about what was happening before this, for lots of centuries of fighting against each other. What I wanted to ask you is that nowadays, as an Englishman, see Scots as an equal. I mean, they are brothers or stepbrothers. Because the question is very easy, because we cannot just see the political issue or the economical issue. We have to see all the cultural points, the cultural links that connect them or not. So I wanted to know if an Englishman considers Scots as an equal, as a brother, as a...
I think they still do. There were lots of surveys during the referendum, as you would expect, about English views and perceptions of Scotland. And by and large, they showed that the majority of English people wanted Scotland to remain part of the United Kingdom, that they thought the country would be weaker and poorer if they lost Scotland, which implies in it some sort of affinity, if not affection, but a strength of bonds because of that long relationship. But at the same time, there was a segment of English opinion which just thought, just let them go, just please stop complaining and just go off and do your own thing and stop taking our money and stop whining endlessly. But that was not the majority view. The majority view, as I say, was to maintain the relationship, but on a reconstituted basis, with more autonomy in England as well as Scotland. But of course there's a range of views in England, just as there's a range of views in Scotland towards the English. And of course, we dwell as ever on Scotland and England, but Northern Ireland and Wales sort of got left out of the debate. The United Kingdom is a four-way relationship, not just a two-way one. But it suited the SNP to cast it in Anglo-Scottish terms only.
It was already made. Thank you.
Anyone else? Okay, so just to finish, I would like to. This is you already spoke a bit about this, but I would like to end with this probably this irony, or probably it is probably a positive a note. As we talked at the beginning, or before the conversation, sometimes we feel this irony of wanting passionately that the UK remains the same, but sometimes, as you told us earlier, we don't know what the UK is for. What are we defending? What are we hoping for? What do you think, if there is any? Of course, we like the UK because of every cultural affinity we have with its culture, of course, and with its be it its literature, its history, its music, whatever. But as an identity, why is it good to the world that the UK remains the same and remains a United Kingdom?
Crikey. That's the million-dollar question. There's a strong historical argument. Even when Scotland and England were independent countries, they had an affinity. They had shared cultural and historical ties. They shared a king. They shared several kings for a century before they were unified. So there was always a relationship there. The idea of Britain predates by several centuries, 1707, the Act of Union. Nowadays, there is the soft power argument. The UK tops many polls of which countries in the world have the most significant soft power impact, so not necessarily economic or military, but cultural, literary, educational. And the UK remains a world leader in those terms. And also, an argument Gordon Brown made, that the UK is a very successful and very old example of how you can make a multinational state, like Germany, Italy, both unified in relatively recent terms, Spain, Belgium, how you can make a multinational state a successful union and partnership, and how that can benefit everyone, not to the same extent, but it can bring benefits to every member of that multinational state. And in terms of distribution of sources, this is a more left-wing argument, but Gordon Brown made it in terms of, he used the phrase pooling and sharing resources. So North Sea oil is discovered in the 70s. It doesn't just benefit Scotland, it benefits England, Northern Ireland and Wales, and does for several generations. Similarly, if Scottish banks get into trouble, the Royal Bank of Scotland a few years ago, the British Treasury moves to deal with that situation. So it's a reciprocal relationship. A lot of these arguments are difficult to make, especially after the financial crisis of several years ago. Much harder to make, but at the same time they should be easier to make. There becomes an argument for larger units of government rather than smaller ones. But as I say, it's not a. If it was an easy argument to make, you wouldn't be asking me that question.
But we ended on a positive note after all. Thank you, David, for being with us.